My name is Francesco Carlo Campisi. I got my doctorate at the University of Montreal, and today we are going to be looking at a presentation I made back in 2021 for a SecRev conference online. And we're just going to be reviewing it, seeing what's still relevant today, what's changed, and what other thoughts come into my head as the video plays along.
Thank you for those that are here now listening to the presentation. I want to thank Benoit Dupont. I caught the end part of your presentation. It was very lovely. So I'm just going to jump right into it. There was a lot to talk about, and I'm hoping to get through as much as I can in as little time as I have. So, as part of my ongoing doctoral dissertation, I began with sort of the lofty goal of trying to understand the way online social movements influence greater support and participation online, specifically with social media users. So, literature on the subject revealed what would end up becoming the principal question of my presentation. How do we define influence? The interactional process between online social movements, social media platforms themselves, and social media users each have a sort of role to play, influencing and being influenced upon. But I quickly noticed that the term influence is sort of this ubiquitous and yet ambiguous term that changes from one research to another.
So this is actually still true today when we discuss the word influence, especially within the field of criminology. We have a tendency to focus on groups that are much more structured. We're thinking terrorist groups, organized crime. With a hierarchical structure, the recruitment process is ritualized, organized, and developed over many years. But we tend to forget about the spectrum of in between of organized crime and sort of mainstream movements and all of these deviant groups in the middle that aren't recruiting in that sort of traditional sense we think about, but are still online influencing greater online support, participation, and engagement, which could be detrimental in the long run, especially with like sort of gateway deviant groups like QAnon that lead into other far right factions. And as it is relevant today is what do we mean when we use the term influence? It's we see the word influence in statistics, we see the word influence in social sciences, we see the word almost in every discipline, and it almost has a different standard of meaning each time. So I really started this project just conceptualizing everyday terms for the research community.
So again, I asked, how do we define influence within this context? What do we mean when we say this movement influences others into X, Y, and Z? At the same time, the term online social movement encompasses a wide variety of socio-political ideologies, values, and perspectives, all that could change different influencing techniques that they use to influence greater participation with the movement among social media users.
And so the online social movements wasn't, it's not a term that I coined necessarily, it's myself, but there is a huge dynamic shift when we're talking about movements. And I say movements, again, the broad spectrum of movements, both like mainstream, pro-Palestine, even BLM, though they have, their conflicts, but QAnon movement, incel movement, hacker movements, all sort of in the last 15, 20 years adopted a main online presence. You're not seeing them at information sessions. They're not necessarily protesting on the streets. They're not on message boards, but they are on social media. And it was a very interesting sort of way to conceptualize how all of these groups influence participation, considering they're all using varying the same medias, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We finally have them all in one room, and so we can now see and compare what influence means when we talk about online movements.
So in the following 15 minutes or so, I will be presenting two main objectives. The first is a conceptualization of the term influence. So using almost 70 articles and books, I use a thematic.
Yeah, since that time, that number has actually increased from 70 to about 300 articles and books, all dealing with anything to do with the dynamics between social movement organizers, influencers, accolades, and the way they try to reel in new novel participation from individuals. Because online social movements, they're not well structured. There's not formal leaderships like we know it today. But they do play a role. So when we say QAnon, we're not talking about a QAnon leader. When we say anonymous, there isn't any one, you know, no one director, president of Anonymous, but there are anonymous affiliated accounts, anonymous affiliated influencers, QAnon influencers. I think they're called QTubers, though a lot of them in the last 4 years, at least since January 6th, have sort of been stamped out from the mainstream social media sites. But that's actually kind of changed, especially since we're now living in Elon Musk's X. A lot of the QAnon rhetoric has slowly started coming back. And I mean, that's going to play into the fact that a lot of January 6ers have been pardoned and released. That could only increase, in my opinion. But back to what I was doing, conceptualizing the term influence. Again, I say I'm using a thematic analysis, and it is somewhere between a systemic literature review and a content analysis, or like just a standard literature review. I wasn't in a position at the time to do a systematic literature review. I still today hadn't necessarily done it, but the level and scope to which I went through 300 sort of articles, books, does speak to the fact that there is something to say here, and we are all having the same conversation, but we were having the conversation in almost like different languages. And my goal here was really to piece together and just find a way that what are we all saying and how does it make sense? Let's use the same, not formal language, but let's try to come up with one language to describe the relationship between these online movements and the way they influence individuals.
And shows articles that talked about online movements, social media, and whose research used the term influence, interaction, and participation and such. In doing so, I extrapolated 7 different influencing techniques, we'll call them, that online movements use in order to influence participation online. As for the second objective, using prior research and a preliminary content analysis of certain online movements, I'm going to be presenting a case study analysis of both the QAnon movement and the hacktivist group Anonymous, and presenting if those influencing techniques are used on social media, to what extent, and how they influence greater participation and how they influence each other. So one of the main results, which I will describe later, is that we see that influencing techniques interplay within one another in a sort of web of influence. So given the first objective, I decided to conceptualize the term influence. So using thematic analysis, I uncovered 7 different ways in which online movements influence participation with social media users: superficial campaigns, individualization, visibility, calls for mobilization, disseminating information, identification, and framing. As you can see on my PowerPoint presentation, I kind of split them into 2 groupings of influence. The first is what I call action-based influencing techniques, and those are content explicitly posted by the online movements, by online movement administrators, to gain some sort of interaction with the movement, very explicit ways of interacting with social media users. The second, I call structure-based influencing techniques. And what they are is essentially that certain characteristics of the structure of social media allows online movements to greater use techniques to influence people into engaging with the movement. So without these sort of structures, without these characteristics, maybe the movement wouldn't have used these certain techniques. And also I felt that they were a separate category in them of themselves.
Right, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this in the literature. I didn't get a chance to talk about this, sorry, in the presentation. But action-based influencing techniques, based on the literature, is the four that I identify: calls for mobilization, dissemination of information, identification, framing. All of this already existed. There's almost none of this that I made up myself. It's everything. Every article was discussing collective identity, but again, using a different language. And so all I did was combine them and saying all of this falls under this more umbrella term of just identification. What they're trying to do is essentially create situations where they bolster collective identity. And I mean, again, that is not a new technique by any way, shape, or form. I mean, we've been looking at framing and social movements for the better part of like 40 years of research. What all I did was sort of translate that into what it looks like today on social media. So how do we bolster collective identity on social media? How is the content we see from social movements adding to the framing, adding to calling for mobilization, how those plays into the overall goal of engaging new users, right? As for the structure-based influencing techniques, those as well, while I pulled it from the literature, it's very clear that they only arise from social media. And I clearly go through that in the next few minutes, but structure-based influence techniques only exist on social media. The environment of the communication milieu of social media as it is made it so that we all have to abide by certain rules of the platform, and therefore the movements have adapted to the platforms. And those three techniques I identify are those adaptations.
Now, when we discuss structure-based influencing techniques, we see superficial campaigns, visibility, and individualization. And I hope my presentation is visually clear enough. I tried to find different ways to show this sort of interplay. And what we see, for example, with superficial campaigns is because there's such a plethora of social media users, right? There's social media users, you got influencers, you got businesses, you got other online movements, and sort of all of these users are sort of vying for attention. Don't forget, just on Twitter alone, there's 192 million active daily users in 2021 alone.
And then that number has only really gone up. I think it was as a today. I don't have the statistics for X itself, but 2021 there was something like 4.9 billion. Now we're at 5.2, 22 billion active daily users using social media, just social media in general in 2025. And I mean, that it only keeps increasing every year. So anyone using social media usage data within the year, it becomes obsolete and needs to be updated.
So everyone's really trying to get as much attention as possible. And in doing so, researchers have noted that there's very little deep involvement with online movements online. For the most part, it's very, as I say, superficial, right? So online movements have sort of adapted to this new structure and have created easily attainable campaigns, easily attainable goals, right? Share this post, send this to a friend, like this page, right? This is what we call clicktivism, a shortening of the term click activism, right? And how does this influence social media users to engage with the movement? Well, it gives users a sense of accomplishment, right? Because it's such an easy task to do to just share a post, like a profile. The user then feels like they've accomplished something, feels like they're a part of the movement, and then again influences them further to engage even more with the movement. When we're looking at things like visibility, this is super important because social media plays such an active role in online social movements visibility. Nothing is guaranteed visibility online. And a lot of times it's because social media platforms have what we call meaningful engagement algorithms, in which a social media platform will push certain content to the forefront while indirectly suppressing others. And usually the ones that they're pushing forward are things that they know, content that they know will get engagement through comments, through likes, through shares, right? And one big example is the 2016 Ferguson riots were actually on social media were obscured for the first few days because Facebook was actively promoting the ice bucket challenge, which was much more popular at the time, which was happening around the same time. And Facebook knew they were going to get more engagement, more participation on their platform because of it, and were giving more visibility to the ice bucket challenge instead of the riots. It took almost 3 to 4 days, according to literature, before the riots had become much more visible online.
So this wasn't actually my conclusion. This was discovered by Zineb Tufekci, who is an excellent researcher on social media and social movement, online activism in and of itself. And it pertains, I think it comes from the Tufekci's 2017 book, Twitter and Tear Gas. And again, it's still meaningful today. It still holds up today. Social media is not, I mean, we discuss it as a communication platforms, but they have their own role to play. They are an actor in and of itself in this communication. So even though we're looking at movements and how they influence individuals, there is a third party in the room, the social media in and of itself, the algorithms that will, though I don't use the term here, shadow ban some content, pushing others to like the forefront of our recommendation feeds, our news feeds, and that plays into visibility. The thing I would change if I had a chance to do this, I think again, was I would change the name of the technique. Because I mean, I have since for my dissertation, and the technique I discuss in and of itself, I call it technological manipulation. Not because it is the negative sense of manipulation, but we see social movements on all levels of the spectrum using social media features, hashtags, user tagging, search engine optimization techniques, all in the effort of attaining visibility, playing off the fact that social media algorithms work a certain way. So if you want that visibility, if you want people to notice you, if you want to influence, you sort of have to play the social media algorithm game. And I use the term technological manipulation to essentially describe their attempts at garnering visibility. And visibility becomes the resource for greater influence. Rather than calling visibility the influencing technique, as I seem to do here, I have over time deepened and more nuanced that form of technique. Visibility is in the technique. The hashtags and the social tagging and the search engine optimization, those are the techniques. What they're aiming for is visibility, because visibility is how you influence. You can't influence anyone from the background, right?
I get the impression that the machine is designed just to optimize engagement. There's no sort of moral aspect to what gets privileged and what gets shadow banned.
There are almost two schools of thought on that. You could look at a lot of authors that are very critical of social media, even Facebook. There was, and I know I'm going to butcher the name, but the article itself it's called the Authoritarian Playbook, and they have a very critical view of social media, and so that they've actually seemed to have favored almost explicitly far-right and extremist, fascist, authoritarian content. If you're to take a more neutral position on it, you have to know that there is a political leaning on social media. They're not doing it out of morality, but regardless on what side of the spectrum you're on, more right and far-right content does get more engagement from individuals who are on the right or the left side of the spectrum. Personally, I believe it's the type of content too. Rebecca Lewis wrote a report in 2018 called Alternative Influencing Network. It was such a good report. I think I've read it more times than I've read some of my favorite books. And in it, she also describes that the type of content that is more aligned with left-leaning media is almost boring. It's statistic, it's theory, this is the data we know from 30 years of research, but it doesn't play to anyone's emotions. And especially when you're thinking about movements and content and engagement, the thing that engages people the most is emotion. Because left-leaning media is, and I'm going to use the term here, sort of objective and boring, right-leaning media uses video content, emotional calls, maybe inflammatory statements, because it's either going to rile up their base, which just adds to some sort of collective identity, or it's going to anger the left, and then they're going to jump in on the comments. And so you could say that they don't have a moral stance. Their goal is visibility and more engagement because they just want people on the platform. But I think to a certain extent, the algorithms have to naturally favor far right content because that's just the thing most people engage with. Whether they agree with the content or not that's not the argument. But there is an alternative. There is an alt right pipeline, but there's no alt left pipeline, and there has to be a reason for that. It just can't be because they're moralistically for or against it. I think it's that it comes down to the individuals. We just like that type of content more. We either enjoy it or it pisses us off.
And what they end up doing is publishing more extreme and more controversial content, because what ends up happening is the more extreme and controversial the content, the more people are willing to engage, whether it's positive or negative, which gives them more visibility, which pushes the content even further, allowing an even wider audience. And it kind of snowballs into this user engagement online.
No notes.
The third structure-based influence is individualization. Much like superficial campaigns, we're seeing a lot of more informal connections online, right? Being part of a movement isn't what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. Membership fees, attending meetings, information kiosks, etc. Nowadays, to be part of a movement is much more informal, much less structured, right? And so online social movements have decided to give more control online to individual users. Instead of working within the framework of what an administrator would tell people what to do, you can be part of this movement within these many parameters at this many protests. Online social movements have sort of relinquished that sort of control and allowed individuals to interact with the movement and people in the movement in any way they feel, shape, or form. And that gives people a little bit more sense of control. It gives social media users the feeling that they can control their actions a little bit more without being limited by formality. All of these influence social media users to engage with the movement, right? Visibility provides visibility. So superficial campaigns provide an incentive, and individualization gives people a sense of control.
So I do make the point about the sort of formality and informal connections, and that does come from social media. It's not to say that sort of decentralized informal movements didn't exist in the past, and it's not to say that formal hierarchical structural movements don't exist today. But the pre-internet era, if you wanted to engage with a movement, there were a lot more formal steps you had to take, at least more publicly formal steps. Maybe you had to man a kiosk, go to an information session, a newsletter that you would get. You would sign your name on something and be part of a distribution of newsletters. There were more formal steps. Today, what does it mean to be part of BLM? Is it a sticker? If I repost 10, the 11th is free and I become like it's so much more informalized, and I think social media does have a role to play because they have, in a sense, informalized a lot of the interactions between individuals and groups, even between individuals and companies. I mean, Wendy's has a Twitter account that you can message and they'll answer back. It won't be formal, but it's an informal connection you've made with a company. And we see the same thing with movements. There is a lot more informal ways to participate with a movement. Like I said, you could just keep reposting BLM. Does it make you part of the movement? Yes. Depends who you ask, but it's that level of ambiguity that keeps it informal.
As with action-based influencing techniques, well, these are a little bit more straightforward, less complex, right? Because there's specific content geared to influencing. You got calls for mobilization, content that explicitly calls users to join a movement. Think like a propaganda video, right? It's usually a video, a post, or a piece of content that elucidates an emotional response in a user watching it. So it could be past protests, violence, maybe visceral acts regarding a certain socio-political issue. And all of this is really to engage people into joining the group, working with the group for whatever their goals may be. Disseminating information is a little different than calls for mobilization. Disseminating information isn't outright asking to participate, but online social movements will post more content about the movement itself, what they're about, dates and times for protests, meetings, how to be a member. And the relationship with influence is pretty straightforward. It's actually very simplistic. The more a movement posts about the movement, the more people are willing to engage. Identification is very interesting. It's basically content that provides a shared identity between the movement and new members. Though this is not an online social movement, I like using the example of Hell's Angels, right? So to identify yourself as a member of the Hell's Angels, you do need to relinquish and realign certain of your identity as part of the movement, as part of the group. So you will dress a certain way, have certain values, wear certain clothings, and perceive the world in a certain way, right? So online social movements will, as with any other group, post content that tells people how they can identify and creates a sense of solidarity among new members or curious people who then might identify and end up engaging with the movement.
So since then, I've actually, I would say changed, but more nuanced the idea of identification. It's not so much about proposing a set of values and then letting people come in. It's more so that they'll develop strategies and content that enable people to interact with the group, either new sort of perspective members or novel members, and give them a framework in order to feel like they're a part of something bigger. Religious groups do this all the time: Bible studies, Wednesday night meetings, bake sales. All of those aren't necessarily with about the religion in and of itself. It's to build a sense of community. It gets people interested. It helps rope in new members. And we see the same thing with social movements. Online, it's even easier. It's share a post. It gives you a sense of connection with the movement. But more explicitly than just sharing posts, I mean, Black Lives Matter, during their height in 2021, they had a Blackout Tuesday where, I don't remember, I think it was a day in April, in May, where everybody was encouraged to post a black picture on their Instagram feed as a show of solidarity, right? That doesn't have a huge impact other than getting people who want to feel that they can participate to participate. It gives them a sense of collectivity. It gives them a sense of identification with the movement. And the more you can create activities or symbolic ways for people to feel included, the more they will adhere to the movement itself. Among the far right, there is countless ways they do this, both online and offline. It's very symbolic gestures of acts, dressing, adhering to certain values, liking certain games. The trad wife movement, if to feel part of the movement, you have to dress a certain way. You have to really enjoy making bread. All of these are just ways to open the door for people to feel more engaged. The more they feel more engaged, the more they're willing to stay engaged. Another offline that I'm thinking of is during the Maple Spring protests here in Quebec in 2012, the student protests. If you want to show your alignment to the student protests, you will wear a little red square on your shirt, on your jacket, on your school bag. That is, again, another way to show adherence to a movement, but it also opens the door for new people who are curious by these acts of symbolic adherence. And so if I had to change anything today, I'd really make that nuance with identification. It's not these are our sets of ideologies conform. It's more, let's bring them in through these sort of symbolic acts and gestures that make you identify with the community they're trying to create.
And the last technique is framing. Very similar to identification, but slightly different. So the example I like using best is the Black Lives Matter movement. So while you don't need to have a shared identity. No one necessarily needs to be Black or a person of minority to be a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. There is a sense of shared values and goals in which you feel attributed to the movement. So the online social movement will frame a narrative, essentially saying if you want to be considered a member of this movement, if you want to engage with us, you need to share perceptions of equality amongst all people, right? And so that creates a narrative that sort of explains what the movement is about. And the more online social movements create a narrative, create a specific type of framing, the more they're able to target specific types of people who can identify with that narrative?
I can only assume I was having a stroke in those last 20 seconds because I did probably the worst job explaining framing possible in this section. Bear in mind, I was it's only been, it was only a year I think I'd been working on the project, and not, you learn something new every day if you keep going and you keep learning, and you learn to better yourself as it is. But framing in and of itself isn't a new concept, especially within movements of all natures. And all framing is the story, the narrative the movement wants to tell that will justify and validate their values, their morals, their ideologies, their goals, their objectives, their beliefs, all of that, right? And so if, for example, Black Lives Matter is suggesting defund the police, they have a framework, a narrative built that justifies their want to defund the police. So it could be to put more money in the community rather than policing. It could be in the ineffectiveness of policing. It could be in the problems with militarization and policing. Like, so framing, all it is what is the story they're trying to tell that justifies their views, their beliefs, their values, and is essentially how they're going to sell to the individual the merits of their cause. And I just don't know why I didn't get that at the time.
All right. So those are the 7 forms of influencing techniques that I found in the literature. Now, as part of the second objective, I wanted to see if these influencing techniques are actually witnessed, observable on social media. And in doing so, I chose 2 groups, Anonymous and QAnon. I found it very interesting to choose the both of them because they're vastly different on the socio-political spectrum, right? But they share a lot of interesting similarities. Both.
And so I say that they're vastly different. I don't go into it in the presentation, but you could put Anonymous closer to the far left. I wouldn't put them strictly on the far left because I would reserve those for anarchist groups, black bloc techniques, socialists, communists. But Anonymous does pertain a lot of values that are a little bit more on the left. The reason I would put them closer to the far left is because of their hacking campaigns. There is a criminal element to Anonymous. They do a lot online. There's a lot on social media. A lot of it is very performative, but there's no doubt that there is an element to this movement that is legally concerning for a lot involved, including the 20 or so governments that they've hacked in the last 20 or odd years. And because they blur that line and place jump rope with criminality, I would put them on a sort of far left spectrum. And I do the same thing with QAnon. In and of itself, it has its own problems. Is it in and of itself far right extremists? Depends on your definition, how you define the spectrum. But they do have a little bit of a hop and scotch between far rightism and almost a gateway into other aspects of far rightism. And I will explain that, I think, later in the presentation. QAnon, interestingly, is a sponge, and as such, they take a lot from other far right movements in their environment. And so depending on which aspects of the QAnon conspiracy theories you sort of align with, that will put you on different levels of that spectrum.
Function almost uniquely online and on social media sites. Both have a specific socio-political values and goals, which they elucidate, which they present, and which they attempt to influence others into accepting. And both have attempted to mobilize people both online and offline. So I used the 2 of them as very separate case studies to see if any emerging influencing patterns came up. So for those who don't know, Anonymous is a loose collective of hacktivists in which they focus on issues regarding to human rights, individual and collective freedoms. They initially emerged in 2006 on the public imaging board 4chan, and originally they were more like like practical jokers, considered trolls, right? Trolling people online and using hacking techniques to just disrupt people's everyday lives. after 2008, after Project Chronology, where they targeted the Church of Scientology, Anonymous became much more involved in socio-political issues. And so it's really around 2008 where we see Anonymous evolve from a group of practical jokers online to being heavily involved in the hacktivist world, using hacking techniques as an activist tool. As for QAnon, QAnon also emerged on 4chan, but much later than Anonymous in 2017. Now, the reason it's called QAnon is because a person, an individual on 4chan, nicknamed Q, claimed to be a high-ranking military official in the Trump campaign with Q-level clearance, hence the name Q. And now Q claimed to have classified documents which depicts former President Trump's struggle against the deep state. For those who don't know, the deep state is a conspiracy theory in which a secret society of millionaires, politicians, political influencers, military, tech giants, all control the government policies nationally and internationally for their own sort of nefarious gain. The second conspiracy theory that Q proposed is that Q claimed to have possession of documents suggesting that Hillary and Bill Clinton are part of a secret human trafficking child pedophilia ring, right, known as the Cabal. And
And there's actually a lot of overlap between those two theories, almost so that they could be one and the same. Deep state, cabal really just falls under the same sort of umbrella term. I mean, at that point, we could just throw Illuminati in the mix as a global term for what they're trying to say. Since then, QAnon, I mean, has, as I said, they're a sponge. They, as a conspiracy theory, they're an umbrella term at this point. They've integrated the Wayfair human trafficking conspiracy theory, the adrenochrome conspiracy theory that we still hear about today, you know, taking adrenochrome from children in order to remain young. That's how, as they say, allegedly Tom Cruise and Tom Hanks are staying young. And QAnon has integrated all of these conspiracy theories under their umbrella term of QAnon conspiracy theory, which really makes them really interesting as a conspiracy theory, because a lot of conspiracy theories are very self-contained. There's some overlap, but not a lot generally. QAnon to this day, even though they had a sort of social media total ban after January 6th, after the January 6th riots, they have to still remain relevant to researchers who are looking at conspiracy theories, because you can't discuss most conspiracy theories without falling into some sort of QAnon rabbit hole, even today, I think.
so what's super interesting about QAnon and almost unique in this regard is QAnon functions somewhere in between an online movement and a conspiracy theory, where in the one sense, they are like a movement in which they have specific sociopolitical beliefs in which they propose and they try to convince others of, but they base these sociopolitical beliefs on a foundation based around these two conspiracy theories. And that makes
I think what also makes them a movement, if you compare them even to, let's say, flat earthers, whether you call them a movement or not, at the end of the day, they're not looking to mobilize in some sort of socio-political way. They have a view, they wish more people would accept their views of the earth being flat. But after the riots in January 6th, you can't seem to argue that QAnon does have a sort of socio-political agenda. And I think because of that and how they've mobilized offline, you can't not consider them a movement. They are a movement based on a conspiracy theory, but they have socio-political goals, and we have to consider them within the spectrum of what we would consider a social movement.
them almost unique completely in this regard. Now, as for the patterns in influencing techniques, one of the first things we see both in Anonymous and on QAnon is actually that framing is very important to the groups. So for Anonymous, they framed their group as a leaderless collective with equal action amongst members. Anyone can take a part of it and anyone can choose a socio-political issue and what to do with that issue. They also create narratives in which any individual who's willing to expose infringement on human, individual, and collective freedoms can be part of anonymous, right? They value freedom of information. And so as they frame this narrative, it has profound effects on the way they use the identification technique, and also explains why dissemination of information is one of the most popular uses, one of the most popular uses of techniques for anonymous. So let me explain. Given that anonymous frames their group as anyone who wants to engage, anyone who's willing to expose infringements on human rights, individual and collective freedoms can be part of it. It's very vague, it's very open-ended, right, as a narrative. And the reason for that is because Anonymous isn't really interested in shaping people's identity to fit the movement. All right? Researchers have actually noted that what ends up happening is that Anonymous doesn't wish to appeal to the supporter base on any one single issue or value. But what they want is potential participants to choose to engage with the movement based on pre-existing individual identities instead of attempting to forge a new collective identity around this group. So what
While I still think that's true today, if I had to look back on it now, presenting it, I would make a little bit of a change in the nuances of it all, mostly because Anonymous is Anonymous frames themselves as sort of nebulous. Will take when like anyone can be a part of it, but to say that they're not really looking for more participation would technically be a lie, because they do have very specific values and they do have very specific ideologies and very specific morals. Though it wasn't part of my thesis, I'd published an anonymous article with my supervisor here at the University of Montreal, and what we noticed is they are very specific to individual rights and freedoms, specifically freedom of expression, freedom of mobilization, freedom of information. They have other values as well. They don't attack the press, has always been a big value for anonymous members through a plethora of anonymous campaigns. And so to say that they don't have an identity, or they're not looking to mobilize based on any one issue, it's true because they do focus on a lot of different sociopolitical issues, but all of these sociopolitical issues do have something in common, and it's due to infringements on freedom of speech or freedom of mobilization or freedom of information and such. And so I would change a little bit of what I said there, just in the details of identification, because they are not trying to shape pre-existing identities, but they do have a very large sort of encompassing ideology, because I think anyone on any level of a spectrum could say that they support individual rights and freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of information is not something that is politically biased. It is just very open-ended. It's something that almost anyone would accept. And so as such, I think it plays to a larger mass than I make it seem in my presentation. It's very specific, but very broad. And so they don't need to shape anyone's values or morals, because I think it's something that anyone would say that they would agree with. Now, from that point, to what extent that they would mobilize or hack is a different question. But on social media themselves, it's so vague that it's alluring for the individual who's just trying to understand Anonymous, because it starts off as, I also am for freedom and individual rights and collective rights.
targets the people they would like to attract, Anonymous keeps the net wide open, essentially, a wide open net to collect as many people as possible. As long as you're willing to expose infringements on human rights and individual and collective freedoms, you can be part of Anonymous too, which is why some of their models say, we are everyone, we are no one, right? Anyone could be it as long as you're willing to stand up for freedom.
Yeah, I really got to let myself finish. The middle sometimes gets a little musty, but I seem to come to the same conclusions I'm coming today. So I'm really happy about that, because past me and me are at least agreeing on the end point, though the middle has been refined in the last few years throughout my research.
At the same time, like I said, dissemination of information is one of the most popular forms of content that Anonymous publishes. Why? Is because they frame their narratives around valuing freedoms, freedom of information, freedom of expression. And so because of that, they're very big on promoting just information in general. A lot of their content is just strictly information about certain socio-political events, things that are happening on the world, commentary on socio-political events, trying to share as much information about the world as possible. And so we can see how framing plays into the other techniques. While framing itself doesn't seem to be Anonymous's goal of using framing to influence, framing does influence the other techniques and sort of increases their efficiency at influencing social media users at joining and speaking with the group.
Even through the finalities of my research, this is still true today. I present 7 influencing techniques, and though I don't discuss all of them fully in my case studies, within my thesis itself, I do spend a lot of time discussing how they interrelate, they work symbiotically. Not any one group is going to use all 7 techniques within one time frame, within one space, but the more information you disseminate, the better your frame. The better your frame, the more people can identify. The more people identify with the movement, the more visibility you have. The more visibility that you have, the more individual collective actions you can take. And so they're always playing off each other, definitely.
As for QAnon, what we see is that QAnon creates a sort of narrative around doubt, fear, and narratives about truth seeking. At the end of the day, QAnon, like I said, their foundation is a conspiracy theory, right? So what they do is that QAnon really puts the emphasis on getting people to question themselves, encourage a culture of doubt, getting people to question long-held beliefs regarding political powers, secret societies, public health. QAnon frames the world as hiding truth from people while simultaneously providing critical structures and critiques necessary for uncovering the truth.
And so those critical structures are, QAnon really focuses on numerology, gematria, the idea that certain letters in certain places correspond to certain numbers and vice versa, which is a code in and of itself. The photo I present there too, ironically from James Comey, is a tweet that has been sort of dissected to pull out what they're really trying to say. And so the framework, as a conspiracy theory, their framework is sort of this idea of distrust, and that there's always something in the background, something to be found, something to be dissected, which as I try to make clear in my presentation, keeps the door open for engagement, because people love a good puzzle, right? And want to break it down.
What do I mean by this? Well, the QAnon narrative is such that they tell you don't believe things that are being posted, critique this in this way, they're lying to you in this way. Anything that's contradictory information is considered to be false or part of the deep state, a way that the cabal can cover its tracks and keep citizens hidden in the dark, right? So the QAnon narrative is one is that find the truth, but as long as it's within the QAnon narrative.
And that's no different with most conspiracy theories. It's almost non-falsifiable, because what's true that fits within their narrative must be true, and what's true that doesn't fit into the narrative is a lie. Not any dissimilar from other conspiracy theories, but again, we have to treat QAnon different from other conspiracy theories because they have mobilized in so many different ways in very violent results. I said January 6th, but we have the white church shooter in New Zealand. The Christchurch shooter in New Zealand that posed a lot of QAnon rhetoric before the shooting. I mean, there was other rhetoric as well. It's not to say that QAnon rhetoric itself was responsible, but there is several other individual sort of lone wolf attack cases where people took what was being said, believed the conspiracy theory, and then went out and attempted to play the hero. And this even predates QAnon, the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which is now an integral part of the QAnon conspiracy theory. The Pizzagate theory led to 2 people separate events, attacking a pizza shop across the street from the Congress in order to free the child slaves that they were hiding in the basement. And so comparatively to Titanic's still around or 9/11 was an inside job, those conspiracy theories don't lend itself out to violent acts and lone wolf attacks. So there is so much crossover as a conspiracy theory, but it is a dangerous conspiracy theory, and it opens the door to so many other things. As an umbrella term, if you fall down the rabbit hole of QAnon conspiracy theory and Pizzagate and adrenochrome, it is 1 to 2 steps away from great replacement theories and other far right white supremacist conspiracy theories.
At the end of the day, when people are looking for the truth and finding information, they're finding stuff that only validates QAnon's conspiracy theories and values even further. How that affects other techniques, well, it has deep implications in the individualization process. While all online movements have some form of individualization on social media, because social media is structured that way, individualization as an influencing technique is so vitally important for QAnon because they realized that comparatively to Anonymous, who is willing to freely give the information to its members and willing participants, QAnon says, well, we know that people want the truth, but they don't want to be told the truth. They want to find it themselves. So a lot of the content that QAnon posts is actually hidden meanings and puzzles for people to figure out, right? It promotes content that forces social media users to search for the answers themselves. And how does that effectively influence them? Well, it puts the onus on the social media users themselves, which gives them a sense of purpose and accomplishment when they find the so-called truth, right? And so individualization is profoundly interesting because the way QAnon structures it, people will go even further than just sharing a post. They'll go further than just liking a post because they take the time to delve into other posts, find different information, decode seemingly innocuous messages, all in terms of finding the truth, right? So QAnon uses individualization.
And that kind of it's the rabbit hole of online social media posts, and it brings back what I was saying before: as is social media particularly left or right leaning? The issue again is right leaning content is more interesting to dissect for a lot of individuals, especially those who are maybe unsure of what their political leaning is. If they had to go through both kinds of content, far right content is more alluring, has more is presented as more of a puzzle, a challenge, a deep dive, and you can fall down a far right rabbit hole, I think, much easier than you could fall down a far left rabbit hole.
To almost take a step further and go further than just simple clicktivism, which has been profoundly effective, right? Especially on social media, of people adding to the conspiracy theory and finding more information and adding to the movements and adding more information. And so QAnon, comparatively to Anonymous, takes a step back and allows its users to function and its users to decide what happens and what they stand for. And so to conclude it, I come back to my original statement. How do online movements influence greater participation online? Well, like I said, I found several different structures, several different influencing techniques, some of which are aided by social media. And I think that's a very interesting point because I want to call attention to the structure-based influences that demonstrate the role social media has in aiding online movements to influence participation, as we saw with the visibility technique and as we saw with individualization and the superficial campaigns. Apologize. And more than anything else, when we look at the case studies, we see how certain influencing techniques don't necessarily directly influence others, but aid in exponentially increasing the way they use other techniques. You know, with Anonymous, one of their goals is to use a narrative of information, right? Freedom of information, and therefore they favor disseminating information. With QAnon, it's more about helping other people find the answers, so they lean heavily on individualization. And I think that's very, very interesting. Like I said, the majority of this work as of right now is preliminary. It's still part of an ongoing doctoral thesis. But what I'm hoping this will eventually lead to, especially since we are talking about cybersecurity, is I'm hoping to apply this sort of conceptualization to different movements to see if certain movements, certain types of movements, have the same patterns, right? And as I take it a step further, maybe I can even focus on more deviant criminal groups and use hate groups online, extremist groups online, and see if developing influencing patterns come up with these types of online movements, right? Maybe, and this could be a long time coming, but we can use this conceptualization of influence and how to analyze it, and more importantly, how it interacts with each other to predict influencing strategies with certain movements. And we see this kind of research every day with jihadist research, especially when they see how they recruit online, right? They use the word recruitment. And when I say participation, we're talking about similar strategies, always influencing others to engage with that movement. I hope I did a quick enough summary of.
As for all of those research possibilities, since then I've done almost none of them. But having developed my thesis through the end, given the amount of literature I put into it, I would say that the first part, the applying this conceptualization to different movements, is generalizable. I came in this wanting to create a sort of generalized framework of the interactions between social movements and individuals. And when I said social movements, it's not any one actor. It is the influencers, the social movement affiliated accounts, the accolades, all those who are peddling movement information and trying to attain greater visibility, all play into the movement itself. And so I came into this wanting to generalize, wanting to create a sort of uniform standard language to explain the processes between how movement influences and how an individual is influenced by. And so given the amount of research I put into it, again, somewhere between 280 and 300 different citations, spanning all levels of the socio-political movement spectrum, I do think I could confidently say that this conceptualization applies to almost all movements. I doubt how certain groups play into it, especially the more organized ones. Jihadists, certain groups, ISIS, they used to and still do to a certain extent have social media accounts. Hells Angels, mafia, triads, when we're talking more organized crimes, they're not going to have that same level of online presence. They're not looking to influence. They're not looking to draw more attention to themselves. So there are certain aspects of groups that don't play into this role. But groups that need continued engagement will always fit into this model.
My research, this is very exciting for me, and I'm really hoping to see how it develops, especially when discussing cybersecurity threats with specific groups and specific movements. If you have any questions, I did leave my email at the bottom, and I'd be happy to discuss this further with anyone who wants to talk about it further.
Still have the same email, still willing to discuss this with whoever's willing to listen.
Thanks for doing that. It was really great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great to watch myself with a glorious COVID beard that I had. And I'm just glad to see the advancements I've made in the 3-4 years since I presented it.